I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for everybody who loves stories about interesting people and events told by those who uncovered them from within their own family trees. This, we hope, will inspire you to discover and celebrate your history and your story. Welcome to Your History, Your Story. In this episode, we journey back to the late 1800s, the final days of the Wild West, when notorious outlaws found refuge in remote hideouts like Robbers Roost, Brown's Hole, and the infamous Hole in the Wall. We're joined today by New York Times best-selling author Tom Clavin, who's here to discuss his latest book, Bandit Heaven, The Hole in the Wall Gangs, and the final chapter of the Wild West. Tom will share riveting stories of some of the West's most infamous criminals, names like Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, Blackjack Ketchum, and Kid Curry. We'll also hear about the women who stood by their side and how legendary lawmen such as Allan Pinkerton and Charlie Siringo, known as the cowboy detective, played a pivotal role in bringing an end to the lawlessness of that era. Stay with us as we uncover the fascinating final chapter of the Wild West. I'd now like to welcome Tom Clavin to our show. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Well, I'm honored because you have really written so many incredible books on topics in American history, sports, military, but I see that you have written a lot of books about the Old West. And just to name a few of them, Dodge City, Wild Bill, Tombstone, Follow Me to Hell, about the Texas Rangers, and The Last Outlaws. And then, of course, your new book, Bandit Heaven, The Hole in the Wall Gangs, and the final chapter of the Wild West, which we're going to talk about today. So, Tom, can you start off by giving us a little background of yourself, where you grew up, and how did you develop such an interest in history, and then maybe kind of narrow it down to why the Wild West? What is so intriguing about it? What is it that sparked your interest?
Well, I think I came of age when, like a lot of kids, there was a keen interest in the American West, post-Civil War American West, because in our culture, we were kind of surrounded by it. You had, if you went to the movies on a Saturday or a Sunday, you could catch double features with Richard Widmark and Glenn Ford in Westerns, and James Stewart and Henry Fonda, John Wayne, of course. And so they were still, Hollywood was producing a lot of Westerns on a regular basis. And television was flooded with Westerns at that time in the 1960s, where you had Rawhide and Big Valley and Have Gun Will Travel and Wanted Dead or Alive and Bonanza, things like that. I think what the difference is, the vast majority of kids who grow up and go out to do something with their lives do not end up being able to make a living out of the Old West and history, unless you become a history professor or a teacher. So my intention was always to be a writer, but I was surprised as anybody that somebody who was born in the Bronx, like I was, Bronx, New York, could end up writing fairly consistently about the American West, the historical American West, the Wild West. But it's just, you mentioned one of my books, Dodge City. That's what got it started. I mean, my sometime collaborator, Bob Drury, and I had done a book called The Heart of Everything That Is, about the Sioux Indian leader, Red Cloud. And I didn't really see that as a Western. I mean, it takes place out west, takes place west of the Missouri River and mostly in the plains. And there was a lot of on-site research for that. But I saw it, right after that, our next book together was, each of us went to do a different book that had to do with the 20th century topic. But with Dodge City, I became kind of fascinated just stumbling around researching with Bat Masterson. Now, the name Bat Masterson is instantly recognizable to many people. And there was also a Bat Masterson TV show, if I remember correctly, with Gene Barry way back in the day. And I wanted to write a book about Bat Masterson because he's usually portrayed, if at all, in any of like the Westerns or Wyatt Earp stories and things like that, as somebody just in the background. He's a peripheral character when he's actually a very important character and a very significant lawman in the Wild West in the 1870s and 80s. And I couldn't convince my co-author, Bob Drury. I thought it would be a good project for us to do together. And I couldn't quite convince him, and by extension, I couldn't quite convince our editor. I think he was correct in saying I don't think there's enough people interested in Bat Masterson to make him able to carry a book by himself. He's probably right. But I started thinking about, well, wait a minute. What's often not portrayed is when Bat Masterson was a very young man and Wyatt Earp was a young man, they walked side by side down the dusty streets of Dodge City as lawmen. And we know many people know about the Tombstone story and other aspects of Wyatt Earp's life, but this is really interesting. They were best friends, kind of new to being lawmen, and yet they took on what was called the wickedest town of the American West. So with that little bit of a bigger picture there, and a lot of other characters, many more than I had ever anticipated would be in the book, once I did start doing more research, that became the book Dodge City. And when the book came out, which I believe was in February of 2017, I was on tour for it. I remember I was in Wichita, and I got a call from my editor at St. Martin's Press, and he said, "Your book's on the list, at New York Times list at number 7." And I said, "You're kidding." I mean, we thought it would be kind of well received, but the kind of attention that it got was really remarkable to us. And as soon as I got back to New York, I was already in a contract to do a different book. But when I got back to New York and we went out to lunch, he said, "You've got to do another book. The people are yelling, 'Where's the next Clavin Western?'" All of a sudden, I was a brand in good sense, not branded. Um, and so I said, "Well, just off the top of my head, another iconic figure who I think needs to be given some attention is Wild Bill Hickok." So he said, "Do it." So I put what I did aside, did Wild Bill, and it grew from there because each book that came out there was a following that was created that kept like, saying, "Okay, when's the next book? When's the next book?" Now I've done books other than westerns, but the westerns are something that there seems to be that core strong audience. I know when I go out on the road to give presentations, they're very nice people and very eager to get the next book and very enthusiastic and very complimentary. So it's been a really good experience.
Yeah, when I was a kid, like you, I used to see a lot of westerns, and I know Gunsmoke was
Oh
one
yeah.
to watch. Bonanza was Sunday night. Watch that. But here's what's interesting. So my mom was English, born in London. Her dad was from Ireland, actually. My mom and my grandfather were the biggest fans of Western movies.
Hmm. Hmm.
And my mom used to actually take me sometimes to the movies and watch these. And of course, you named some of those stars, but I used to love the Westerns. And I also remember coming home from school and watching reruns of The Rifleman.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah. Uh-huh.
Oh, it was so good. And here's the thing. So I've always been interested in the Civil War. And of course, I find the era of the Wild West very fascinating too. Can you sort of set the stage for us for your book, Bandit Heaven, as to what was going on in the United States and its territory, shall we say, in the period right after the Civil War that sort of led up to this period of outlaws in the Wild West?
Well, right after the Civil War, the kind of lawmen who were pretty prominent in these frontier towns were usually very untrained men. I mean, there was no police academy, there's no marshal's academy, sheriff's academy. Many times they were part-time. That in addition to their being untrained in any way. They sometimes were not as good with guns. Sometimes they could barely shoot. And they didn't want to shoot because they were farmers, they were store clerks, they were other th laborers. So when you had a lot of banditry going on, it was getting away pretty quickly. And sometimes the only way that you got your town to stay in some kind of peaceful time to do business and to raise families was that you hired somebody who could outshoot the bad guys. And that's actually what Wild Bill Hickok did. He was hired by the people in Abilene, and after a year, he definitely tamed the town. I mean, the crime was way down, but they fired him because the body count was way up. So, so they figured- they couldn't stomach that anymore. So that was the kind of lawman you had when Bat Master and Wyatt Earp were in Dodge City. It started to change a little bit. They would like ask questions first and shoot later, which was a different kind of way of doing things. When you got to Tombstone, for example, Virgil Earp was the marshal of Tombstone, but his official title was police commissioner. You actually had police departments in a lot of some of these frontier towns now, and deputy sheriffs and people had some experience. When you get to the 1890s, where a good part of Bandit Heaven takes place, um, the law has really caught up with most. There are very few, gangs left. In my book, The Last Outlaws, which is about the Dalton gang. They were like dinosaurs already. They themselves were only in their 20s and early 30s, but they were like dinosaurs in the whole scheme of things because the law was outpacing, just even just technology was doing it. It used to be if it was a robbery, bank robbery took place, let's say in 1870, you had to get somebody on a horse to ride to where 2 or 3 towns away, get the sheriff. That's where the county sheriff is. Get him. In 1895, if you robbed a bank, the local marshal is making a phone call to the sheriff, who's putting a posse together 5 minutes later. So with Bandit Heaven, you really have that last gasp where Butch Cassidy, Sundance Kid, Kid Curry, Elsie Lay, some of these other who were prominent bandits at the time, they were doomed from the beginning because there was no way. A couple of them went straight. They might have done prison terms and then decided, I'm done. I don't stand a chance. But for the most part, these men, and as the book details, they, one by one, they were tracked down, and they couldn't. The occupation of outlaw was outlawed.
That makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, when I think about that period and I think about was there really a fine line between who the bad guys and good guys were sometime?
Uh, Less so as time went on, but you're exactly right that in the 1860s, 1870s, and into the 1880s, in my book Dodge City, there's a character called Mysterious Dave Mather, and he appears in different chapters, sometimes as an outlaw, sometimes as a deputy marshal. It depends on, what he needed for money, what the situation was, how he felt at a particular time. And that happened I mean, with the Dalton gang, for example, their brother Frank Dalton was becoming an emerging as a really celebrated deputy U.S. Marshal, and then he was killed in action by bad guys. And a couple of his brothers who became outlaws also served for a time as deputy U.S. Marshals. So it would happen. I mean, Wyatt Earp, for example, before he got to Dodge City, he was in prison for horse stealing, horse theft. Wyatt Earp had a criminal background, not an extensive one.
Mhm.
But if he had actually, he broke out of jail before his trial. You don't see that on Wyatt's resume usually, but he broke out of jail before his trial. And if he had stayed in jail and gone to trial and been convicted, there's always a chance that he could have been executed for being a horse thief. That happened in those days. So there was a fine line, and sometimes it was circumstantial as to whether you encountered somebody who was doing something bad or doing something good.
Yeah, and I would think that some of the skills developed by the bad guys came in handy for the good guys if they turned him to being a good guy because shooting and knowing where the different places were and who some of the players were, I guess it would come in handy. But when we talk about outlaws, what types of crimes they were committing? So reading Bandit Heaven, I see a train robbery. The book starts off early with a train robbery, which is kind of fascinating when you think of it. I remember as a kid, they had a local steam train, like a museum type of a train, and you went on this trip, and they had these fake robbers come on board with the masks and everything. It was so
Right.
it was so interesting as a little kid. But I think of train robberies, but I know that cattle rustling was a
Yeah.
big part of your book about how some of these people were, stealing cattle. And then, but you get into this whole story about the ranchers, and some of the ranchers were huge, businesses. They were big
Right.
wealthy endeavors. Can you talk about the cattle rustling versus the large ranch holders?
One of the things that fascinated me when I was working on Bandit Heaven, the research that I was doing, is that a lot of these very big ranch owners in Wyoming and Montana and the Dakotas, they were Europeans, especially from Great Britain and Englishmen, because they saw this as a new and very lucrative industry. And it was for the most part. What they hadn't quite anticipated is that the locals would say, well, that nobody's going to mind if we steal 100 head. You know, and and if that happened once or twice, it was no big deal. It's the cost of doing business, but it became more rampant. You steal a dozen here, a dozen there, 100 here, 100 there. And some of these people were cowboys working for the ranch owner who just during the night would carve out, his 20 for myself and hide them for a while, and then bring when nobody was looking, bring them to market and sell them. So cattle rustling was huge because there were simply so many cattle available, and the price of cattle, of the beef was pretty high. After the Civil War, you think, well, the war is over. There's not that big a demand for beef, but the population was expanding all across America, and even people still on the East Coast at the restaurants in Chicago and New York and Boston, Washington D.C., they wanted that beef. So cattle rustling became really an epidemic in the Mountain West, in the Plains West, and that's where a lot of times the lawmen that you had, that was their occupation. But as the Bandit Heaven also talks about, these ranch owners would form their own organizations, and they were, officially they were trade groups. Let's call them trade groups. But what they were was they were protecting themselves. They would hire their own detectives. They would hire, sometimes there's a event in the Bandit Heaven about an invasion of they hired these couple of dozen guys up from Texas to invade this part of Wyoming that was undergoing rampant, catch these rustlers and kill them. So there was a lot of vigilantism going on there because there simply was not enough lawmen to go around.
And sometimes I believe I read that there were instances where these large cattle owners were putting the smaller cattle owners out of business by really squashing them. And
Yeah,
yeah, didn't they do that as well?
they did that as well because it was the small ranchers were really not hitting them hard financially, but it was just the idea that they had a philosophy of open range. And there was the open rangers and the closed rangers that the smaller ranchers were they wanted to have their own operations and just live in a peaceful life. But the large ranchers, you see this as plots in countless movies. You even see this going through as a thread going through the show Yellowstone, which is of course enormously popular, where somebody's been there for a while, has paid a lot of money, invested a lot of money into the property, bought the property legitimately for the most part, done the improvements, put up the fences, put up the barns, put up the accessory buildings, built their own homesteads there. And then these smaller ranchers come in and say, well, we want a piece of the action too. We want to be living here too. We want to do our own cattle operations. Well, no, I paid for all of this. I paid for these watering holes. I paid for this dam put up here to turn fresh water to a certain direction. You can't just dip a straw in it and say it's free for everybody. So that was part of the conflict that Bandit Heaven details is between the ranchers and the smaller ranchers. And the outlaws, for the most part, supported the smaller ranchers because, they were small time operators themselves. Being a rustler was a small business, and their targets were the large ranchers. So the idea was, you could probably, like I said before, take a few head of cattle here and here and there, and get away with it, and until you got to a certain point where the big ranchers were saying, this is too much. We got to come down on these guys.
It's almost like a little bit of a Robin Hood situation where there was a romantic view almost of some of these robbers because they were giving it to these big cattle ranch owners who were, maybe squashing and pushing other people out.
But they weren't turning around and feeding the poor.
No, yeah, I left that part out. You're right.
Yeah, yeah. There's that Robin Hood. They were stealing from the rich, but they were not giving it to the poor.
Well, but they were hurting the guy that they maybe wanted them
Yeah.
to hurt.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
so some of these we're going to talk about these bad guys now are starting to get fewer and fewer because they're getting hunted, they're getting pointed out quicker. But there were still a lot of them out there in the 1890s or so. There's something you talk about in the book called the Outlaw Trail. What was
Yeah.
that?
Well, the Outlaw Trail, and I should credit Charles Kelly, the author Charles Kelly, who, with his book in 1938, I believe it was used that term, or at least popularized it because his book was pretty successful. Um, as there were fewer open spaces for bandits to hide in, there was created over time these three havens for outlaws. One was Robbers Roost, one was the Hole in the Wall, and the other one was what's something hole?
Brown's Hole.
Brown's Hole. Yes, thank you. And these were sort of enclaves where small ranchers and rustlers and other kinds of miscreants, let's say, could exist peacefully together and defend their territory because of sort of geographical advantages. Like Robbers Roost was kind of raised up off the ground. You could see somebody coming from miles away. Brown's Hole was an enclosed valley. The hole was the valley. Hole in the wall, you couldn't get through the rock formations except one or two horses at a time. So again, it was easily defensible if a posse came to chase somebody into a hole in the wall. And the way that you could connect the roads that would connect all three of these, it really extended almost from the Canadian border to almost to the Mexico border, was called the Outlaw Trail. Outlaw Trail is also used as a kind of a euphemism to say if somebody's gone bad, he's now riding the outdoor trail.
Okay. So I'm thinking about these hideouts, and now sometimes these outlaws they've stolen a lot of cattle, and they have to keep the cattle somewhere
Yeah.
while they're hiding out. Were these hideouts where the cattle were as well, or were they would they hide them somewhere else, and then they personally would, hide elsewhere?
It's a little bit of both. I mean, some outlaws had some of their favorite spots that weren't necessarily one of the three Bandit Heaven locations. And as long as those were not discovered by any of the ranchers, they could keep them there. But yes, you're right. In Hole in the Wall, in Robbers Roost, in Brown's Hole, the cattle were brought there, and there was plenty of grass. They were watered. They were taken well care for. Of course, the idea was to add some pounds to them.
Mhm.
And then when it seemed like they could do this discreetly, head for one of the nearby railroad stations and ship them off to, make a deal and ship them off to these processing plants that were turning out the beef, for example. So that was a value of, and they had their own communities there. I mean, the outlaws built ranch houses, small ranch houses, the cabins, and they could spend months there if they wanted to, especially they could winter over in some of these places. Brown's Hole did not have particularly harsh winters, even though it was in the Mountain West, because the enclosing peaks of the mountains and hills would break off some of the snowstorms and the wind from coming in as bad. So you could even keep cattle there year round if you had to, though the ideal was keep them until the fall, and then so you didn't have to try and take care of them over the winter, sell them.
Now, there were people in these hideouts who were not necessarily outlaws in that they weren't going out and rustling or what have you, but that they were friends with these outlaws, that they helped them, they put them up, they maybe supplied them with things. Where I know you talk about some of those people in your book as well.
The Bassett family is an example. You had, the couple, the Bassets, they had a couple of daughters. They run a ranch up there. They themselves were not involved in any criminal activity, but they didn't mind accommodating or hosting people who are committing crimes. As long as you left us alone, and treated us well and helped us out on the ranch, then if you needed some place to hide, well, you can stay at our place. They'd have dinners for the, Butch Cassidy would attend dinners there. Some Sundance Kid, some of the other outlaws, Kid Curry, they would be attending dinners that they would host there. They were having affairs with the daughters. Just talk about being accommodating. And
Sure.
yeah, and there were others like that because they themselves had carved out a place that they wanted to live. They did not have a kind of high moral threshold about, oh, what these guys are cattle rustlers. No, they helped each other to survive until eventually there just were not enough bandits to go around.
Yeah, now we want to talk about some of the bandits. You've mentioned Butch Cassidy already. When I was, I think, 11 years old, my parents dropped a friend of mine and myself off at the movie theater to watch Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid with
Yeah.
Paul Newman and Robert Redford. And what an exciting movie. But certainly watching that movie, you kind of really get to like these guys. They're likable, and it seemed like they're like nice bad guys. So how would you compare the movie Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid to the real people?
The movie, and of course I've rewatched this since I started working on Bandit Heaven more than once. The movie, I think, holds up as a really good movie. And also there are some things in there that are really close to being accurate and some things that aren't. For the latter, I'll give you an example that's seen right at the very beginning of the movie. If some people, those of your listeners who have seen Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, 1969 when it came out, the very first scene has a large man, an actor named Ted Cassidy, no relation to Butch, but he's a big. You'd recognize him right away. He always played these larger than life creatures, often bad guys, and he's having this fight to the death supposedly with Butch Cassidy, and Butch says, "What about the rules?" And Ted Cassidy character says, "No rules." So Butch Cassidy kicks him in the groin. The fight's over. We never see that character again in the rest of the movie. That was Kid Curry. Now, Kid Curry, from reading The Bandit Heaven, is a very prominent member of Butch Cassidy's gang and had his own gangs. It was one of the most ferocious man killers. So there you have somebody who was just a character thrown away in the first 3 minutes of the movie, who in my book is a prominent role because he did play a prominent role in those gangs at that time. So they didn't get that quite right. However, the portrayal of Butch Cassidy, for example, as a rather charming, handsome man who did not like violence is quite true. Butch Cassidy was no doubt an outlaw, but he was not a vicious man, and he was a charming man. Most people liked him, even the judge that sentenced him to jail. When Butch was in jail, the judge wrote a letter to the governor, "Hey, get this guy out." So that's quite true. Also, the Sundance Kid. Sundance was a very handsome guy, a charming guy, moody guy. He did have a relationship that might have been a married one with the woman we know as Ep08, who was played by Catherine Ross in the movie. So several of the characters that the movie dealt with them accurately. I don't know if I should give it away, but the ending scene in the movie is completely fictitious, almost completely fictitious. And so, however, it made for a great ending, and that's freeze frame that ends the movie is one of the most famous ones probably in Hollywood Western history. But it's not quite the way it turned out when Butch and Sundance were down in Bolivia.
Yeah, I know. I don't want to talk too much about what happens in the book because I want people to get the book, but I know there's some mystery surrounding what actually happened to Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid down in Bolivia. There's even rumors that they lived on and they didn't die at that time. And do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think what's in the book is what really happened. It has been researched by some reputable Western historians, even doing some on-site forensic research down in Bolivia, where looking for the actual bodies or remains of Butch and Sundance. And there was what sort of clouded the issue a little bit is there were rumors that Butch at least was back with Kid Curry during his last couple of capers. Butch Cassidy was one of, I think, 9 children, and one of his younger sisters lived to a very old age. I mean, she was writing a book, My Brother Butch Cassidy, I think in the 1960s or 50s or 60s. And she claimed that in something like 1920, Butch paid the family a visit, the remaining family a visit from South America and stayed for a while and to see what probably would be his last visit. And that got all the rumors starting again that Butch had not passed, been killed in Bolivia. So, but I think he didn't get killed the way the movie portrays it. But I think my feeling was, and I point out in the book the difference between the movie ending. But you can't escape it because it is so powerful and so involving, and what really happened, which was also rather dramatic, just not the same dramatic as the movie portrayed.
Yeah, and then there's this person called Blackjack Ketchum, and he's a real nasty sort of character, and he met a rather unpleasant end.
One of the things I loved about Bandit Heaven is that there are, legitimately very weird and strange and colorful characters some of them have very bizarre stories. I get to Blackjack a bit, but one of my favorite little vignettes in the book is that there's a shootout between a couple of lawmen and I think it was maybe Kid Curry's gang, and one of the deputies gets killed in the shootout, but not because he got shot by a bullet. He got shot. He's had a knife in his belt. The bullet hit the knife and pierced the knife pierced his side a little bit. The day before, he'd just been treating some cattle with anthrax using that knife.
Oh
He
no!
died 4 days later from anthrax poisoning.
Oh gosh, what are the odds, huh?
You can't make this stuff up. But with Blackjack Ketchum, he was a pretty bad guy, and he finally got caught after one of his I think it was either train or a bank robbery, and he had killed people. He was sentenced to die, to be executed, to be hung. And during his appeal process, he apparently liked the food in jail because he gained quite a bit of weight. And so what happened was when the day came to, his appeals were denied, when the day came to hang him, they opened the trap door and down he fell. They had not calibrated the extra weight the rope was going to take care of. So it tore his head from his body. So to our knowledge, he remains the only New Mexico prisoner to be decapitated during an execution.
Oh, I hate it when that happens.
Yeah, how it could be. And you had to put them back together again. I assume they did. I don't know if they buried him in two graves.
Oh my goodness. And some of these other you mentioned Etta Place was one of the ladies, and then you mentioned about
Yeah,
the two sisters. It was Queen Anne and her sister Josie,
Josie.
right?
Yes.
And they were, would you consider them sort of like groupies for some of these outlaws at the time?
Yeah, because some of them had more than one outlaw as a boyfriend from time to time. They did. One of the things that I enjoyed including in Bandit Heaven is that there are some very interesting female characters. Now, the most interesting female character in the movie is the one played by Catherine Ross, the at a place. Her real name is Ethel. We don't know what her real name is because she took on the maiden name of Sundance's mother. So that's why her real name was Ethel, but her last name we don't really still to this day don't know what her real last name was. Place was again a name borrowed from the Sundance's family. Sundance was born Harry Longabar. Now Harry Longabar does not inspire much fear into other gunmen, but Sundance Kid that belongs in the Wild West. So yeah, but there's I think it's Maddie Rogers, who's the girlfriend of Kid Curry, Katie Rogers, I can't remember her first name. And you had the Bassett sisters. You had another one who was one of their girlfriends, who's the aunt of one of the other groupie girlfriends. So groupies is a good way to put it because they did when the bandits were back from either getting out of jail, finishing a job, or they had laid low enough that nobody was looking for them anymore. They would reunite with these circle of women who became the Wild Bunch women.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting when reading this book is that you mentioned before about some of them actually living, well into the middle of the 20th century. But I think like Josie, is it Bassett? Yeah, Josie Bassett
Yeah.
was, she was pretty well known right into the 1930s and 40s. I think maybe even longer.
Yeah, some of them, some of these women who were part of American Wild West history did live long enough to sometimes they would write these memoirs. I mean, Wyatt Earp's fourth and last wife, Josephine, died during World War II. She died, I think, in 1944. She wrote a book about my husband, or my husband Wyatt Earp. A lot of it was made up. Well, I should say a lot of it was sanitized because she left out the part when she was working as a prostitute, among other things. Which most people they're doing their memoirs don't necessarily, maybe today, but in those days they didn't tend to include that. The Wyatt Earp had a sister a sister-in-law who lived into the 1940s. We don't know about at a place, but yes, some of Josie Bassett lived into the well into the night. You look at somebody like George Custer's wife, Libby Custer. I mean, she wrote three memoirs about George Custer and didn't die until the late 1930s, which completely shaped our view of Custer, which was partly accurate and partly not. So that was one of the interesting things and helpful things for a researcher like myself, that even though you have to realize that a lot of the stuff is being embellished, if not complete, or left out, if not completely fictitious, but several of these women did live decades after the events that take place and had an opportunity to write about it or were interviewed by newspaper reporters years later.
Yeah. And when we talk about the Wild West, we're thinking, oh, it was such a long time ago, it's such a distant past. It's this something that we're so far removed from. In many ways, we really are. But when you think of it as far as just really how close in time it is, my grandfather was actually born the year after Custer's last stand. Uh,
1877, that would be.
1877, he was born. I mean, he was older when my father was born. My father was older when I was born. So it kind of worked out that way. But it's funny. I remember my father telling me that his dad went to the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago,
Hmm.
and I guess they took a train out there, what have you. And while they were out there, Buffalo Bill had his Wild West show. I don't think it was part of the World's Fair, but it was like next to it or whatever.
Yeah.
But he used to tell my dad that my grandfather told my dad that he saw Buffalo Bill.
Mhm.
Now, and here I'm sitting talking to you. This is just my grandfather. So this time period is not that far off in memory, is it?
No, it's not. And in fact, Wyatt Earp, for example, he died in 1929. So here's somebody who's made his biggest headlines in the 1870s and early 1880s. Not only lived to 1929, but he was living in Los Angeles, and he was consulting on silent film westerns with young directors like John Ford. So he became part of the entertainment business. I mean, Emmett Dalton, who was the youngest and of the Dalton brother and the only one to survive the huge shootout in Coffeyville, Kansas in 1892, he spent 14 years in prison for his participation in that shootout. And then when he got out, he got into the film business. So he actually directed and produced movies about his own brother's gangs.
That's
Uh,
crazy.
so Bat Masterson, we started off me talking about Bat Masterson, who, by the way, is buried in the Bronx, of all
I've
places.
seen his grave. I've actually seen his
Yeah,
grave.
the Greenwood, I think it's the Greenwood. No, it's the Woodlawn Cemetery.
Woodlawn. I've been there about 3 years ago. A friend of mine and I went. We looked at some famous graves, and he said, "Oh, here's Bat Masterson's grave." I said, "Isn't he buried out west somewhere?" He's no,
Right.
he's here.
No, most people don't know that when Bat Masterson in 1903, he turned 50 years old. And he had a very big reputation as a gunman at the time, even though he'd done some other things. And he had years earlier become good friends and stayed in touch with Teddy Roosevelt. By this time, Roosevelt was president. So he wrote to Roosevelt and said, I'm really worried that, I'm 50 years old, some young punk is going to try and make his reputation by trying to outdraw me. And I feel, kind of vulnerable out here. Can you give me a job somewhere else? Roosevelt said, sure. Well, how about you become the deputy U.S. Marshal for Manhattan? So Masterson and his wife uprooted themselves from Kansas, wherever they were, Colorado, where they were living, came to Manhattan. Bat was a deputy U.S. Marshal, which enabled him to carry a gun in New York. And more than that, he became a newspaper columnist and became one of the most popular, if not the most popular newspaper columnists throughout the rest of the 1910s and into 19 teens. And he got to tell a lot of stories to people in the New York audience. He held his favorite place was 44th Street and Broadway Saloon, where he would be a raconteur and tell stories. And when he died at his desk writing his newspaper column in 1921. And that's how he ended up being born in the Bronx with his wife beside him.
So that's oh, so cool. These are great stories. Now, in your book, you talk about I mean, you mentioned about some lawmen, but in your book, you actually start to give us an idea who some other of these guys are. One of them is Allan Pinkerton. Now, the name Pinkerton stands out prominently because you think about Pinkerton security. So, tell us about Allan Pinkerton.
Allan Pinkerton was born in Scotland and then emigrated to the United States. He tried different occupations and he sort of like an amateur way sometime, he actually tracked down somebody who had robbed something. Somebody had committed a crime, and Allan Pinkerton, in his very amateur way, tracked him down. And everybody said, "Wow, you should be a detective." It's like, well, what the heck's a detective? But that's what he became. He ended up investigating crimes and or starting his own detective agency. And the event that got him really put on the map, so to speak, was when he helped to prevent a plot to assassinate Abraham Lincoln when Lincoln had been already elected, but he was on his way. He was making the trip of several days to Washington, D.C. for his inauguration, and there was a plot to assassinate him, and Pinkerton foiled it. And that got him, as you can imagine, over the next few years, a lot of jobs from the federal government. He had two sons who eventually joined him in the firm. One took care of the office in Chicago, one took care of the office in New York. And the Pinkerton agency, it had that "We Never Sleep" with an eyeball as their symbol, became involved. Like the railroads would hire them to track down robbers and thieves, mine companies to investigate and track any labor organizers or others who may have committed any crimes, like any bombings or things like that, to mine operations. So it became an event, and part of their activities was to try and track down these gangs that were still running around in the 1900s. And they had some success, and sometimes people like somebody like a Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid eluded them, and they never caught up with them, much to Pinkerton's frustration.
Yeah, and there was another one, Charlie Siringo. He was
Siringo.
called the Cowboy Detective. Tell us about him.
I love that character, Charlie Siringo. And for most people, they don't really know. I'm just shocked that over these years, there's not been a movie or a television show on Charlie Siringo. He was probably the most traveled, and in some cases, the most successful lawman in the Wild West. He didn't get started as a lawman until I think it was the early 1880s. So he came a little bit past the heyday of the Wild West, but still, He was a Pinkerton detective for many years. He did his own freelance work for years, and he was just kind of unstoppable. During he spent 4 years on the trail of Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, and estimated I think he had gone something like 35,000 miles traveled by horse and carriage and stuff. And he always had this upbeat attitude. Well, I didn't get him this time. I'll get him next time. And he had all these adventures, and he even had one confrontation with Bat Masterson that's in the book. So the book is called Bandit Heaven, but it's also a big part of the book is also about these lawmen like Charlie Siringo. I mean, Tom Horn is a character in the book, and he's both a lawman. He was a Pinkerton agent for a while, but he's also an assassin, and he's presented in both of those roles in the book, Bandit Heaven. He did work for the U.S. Army as a scout. He did some good work, detective work. But on the other hand, he also was hired by the wealthy ranchers to get rid of some of the squatters. They called them squatters in some of these Bandit Heaven enclaves. And his way of persuading them to leave was with a rifle.
Yeah, again, here's this thing where who's the good guy, who's the bad guy sometimes, right?
You can imagine what it was like for their friends. I don't know if I'm meeting a guy that's going to shoot me or is going to hug me. What
Exactly.
what role is he playing this particular day?
So these hideouts began to they cleared out these places. You say it's Bandit Heaven, the hole in the wall gangs, and the final chapter of the Wild West. So when you say final chapter, so these hideouts started to get eliminated, right?
They did. They got eliminated. It's not so much that there would be these attacks on them and they would be wiped out. It's just that there were fewer inhabitants who were of a criminal nature because they were being killed, or they were going away for long prison stretches, or like I said before, they would have been caught, been sent to prison for a while, and then realized that whole Wild West outlaw lifestyle has passed me by. There's no way to live and have any kind of life, especially if you wanted to have a family. You can marry somebody and then you're on the run for a year and a half in the mountains in the Rockies. So the book goes into some not a lot, but some detail towards the end of the book where we catch up with what happened to Kid Curry, what happened to Tall Texan Kilpatrick, what happened to some of the other families that the outlaws that are presented in the book. Elsie Lay, as an example, was a really very, very good friend of Butch Cassidy. What happened to Butch Cassidy? What happened to the Sundance Kid? What happened to Ethel Place, who Sundance said introduced as his wife? And some of them did live well past the Wild West days, and some of them that was the end of their era too.
Yeah, I wanted to know, do you know, could somebody today go visit where some of these hideouts were? Is there anything there that would indicate that that happened in those places?
Yeah, there's one I know of in Wyoming. There's a little cabin complex. It's all pretty derelict right now, supposedly where Butch Cassidy and a friend of his stayed, wintered over one winter. And with other sort of like landmarks, you have to be a little suspicious because it's like George Washington slept here. This is where Kid Curry, shot his final gun, shot himself. This is where the hole in the wall gang came to celebrate at this saloon after they robbed the Wilcox train. So you have to be a little bit careful about that. There are some very good and reputable historical societies that are in Wyoming and Montana and the Dakotas that they have this kind of information. Like because there are people that do that. They get in their car, they hitch up their RV, whatever it is, and they say, we're going to visit, we're going to go on our own outlaw trail. We're going to visit some of these sites that supposedly still exist or at least have been preserved and find out, if those really how valid they are. So that you can find some of these places, a few of them here and there still exist and are valid.
So, Tom, I wanted to ask you, as far as researching this book, the information for this book, what kind of records did you go through? How did you piece this incredible adventure of Bandit Heaven together?
Charles Kelly's book was Outlaw Trail was very helpful because he actually, during the course of his research, interviewed some of the participants in these stories who were still around. And but a lot of it, one of the advantages of writing about the later period of the Wild West is that there was a lot more media available. Now, media is more of a common term, but I mean, there was a lot more press. There were a lot of newspapers available and magazines. And on the East Coast, in the Northeast and East Coast, people were eating up these stories of bandits on the West, on the American West. So you had a lot of contemporary sources to go by that were accounts of what was happening. I'm not saying every piece of it was 100% accurate, but there's an event in there where this sheriff and his team are trying to catch, I think it was Kid Curry and his gang after, and the newspaper was daily putting out editions, keeping their readers up to date as to what was happening with this chase for Kid Curry and his gang, and you could access those files. Now, in some cases, you have to actually go to the source of these, but most things have been digitized by now. So it's still possible that you can go on the like if you want something from the Sheridan, Wyoming, go to the county library there, and they can say, oh yes, we have this. We could email you these files to you, and you can look up some of the actual reporting that was done in Sheridan, Wyoming when the Red Cloud War was going on, things like that. So it's a lot of reading, obviously. Some participants wrote autobiographies or supposed Tom Horn, while he was in jail waiting to be executed, wrote his autobiography. Now, he didn't include the criminal parts that much. He sort of soft pedaled those, but there's a lot of interesting stuff about his life. He had a really fascinating life that unfortunately ended because he got hung himself for probably for a crime he didn't commit, which is interesting. But it's sort of like, well, he might not have committed this one, but we're going to get him for the 15 others who did. He did do it.
Boy, I admire his focus to be ready to be hanged, and you have the ability to sit and write your own autobiography. It's
Well,
crazy.
he was trying. There was an appeal process going on that took some time, and I guess it was a way to, you don't have the kind of prisons where you can, get an in prison college degree in those days like you can now. So he wanted to write about his life, and thankfully he did because a lot of it is quite authentic too. It's been corroborated by other sources.
Did he have a better hangman than the one for Blackjack Ketchum?
Yes, thankfully, and I think he also watched his diet too.
Wow, that is crazy. So when you say the final chapter of the Wild West, what does it mean for you as far as writing about the Wild West? Are there any topics or individuals that you still want to explore and write about?
I don't think I you can't go forward from Bandit Heaven because there really is no Wild West. I mean, there was barely a Wild West during the events of Bandit Heaven. So you can't go forward. Actually, what happened, what the Wild West morphed into in the 1920s and 30s was the gangsters, and their gangs, Pretty Boy Floyd, Machine Gun Kelly, Al Capone. They became like the more contemporary outlaws and gangsters and bad guys. So I'm sort of going back. I'm looking at are there underreported subjects that are really interesting. At the moment, I'm working on a World War II book, but my next book after that has to do with a range war that was the longest range war in American history, where these two families made the Hatfields and McCoys look like they're all part of a seminary together. Um, and so basically, these two families were so stubborn over the long number of years, they wiped each other out. There was only one man left, one man still left standing, and he left people instead of claiming they've been fighting over these properties for years. He just left. So I think there are some really interesting stories to be told that have sort of been overlooked by some of the more famous stories. And if you can find one with some good characters, there's a really strong Wild Bill character, not Wild Bill himself, but a Wild Bill-like lawman in this story, then there's an opportunity to bring those stories to light.
Please keep writing, Tom. You're an excellent writer and researcher, and this is exciting stuff. This is bringing back the rifleman to me almost.
That was with Chuck Connors, if I remember correctly, right?
Chuck Connors, yes,
Another
and
show called Branded.
he was great. He really was. And I understand your book is going on sale on October the 22nd, which is the day after this podcast is being published. So how
Yes.
can people get your book?
Well, I always encourage people to patronize their local independent bookstore. Otherwise, you have the Barnes and Noble options, some other smaller chains. You have Amazon, barnesandnoble.com. People can go to my website, tomclavin.com, and purchase a book through the website. And I want to mention for those people, I'm going to do Bridgehampton, New York on October 22nd. I'm going to be in St. Louis on Monday, October 28th. I'm going to be in Wichita, Watermark Books, Bridge in Wichita, Kansas on the 29th. I'll be Rainy Day Books in Kansas City on the 30th. Probably a couple other things will be added, but I love going out there with the books like Bandit Heaven because you have a really eager audience, and they want to talk about the next chapter in a Wild West story, and they've come to like really enjoy these characters, like they become friends of theirs. So they're always so welcoming, and I'm so pleased to go out and talk to people.
This is an incredible book because it just gets you to dig into these colorful characters who, by the way, you gotta pause sometime and remember that they changed their names. So you have to kind of
Yes.
follow that they changed their names. So you bring it into, to light that these weren't their original names, or they were, they were probably trying to hide their original identities, or they just became known because it was more dramatic or more daring or flair, gave more flair to their careers or what have you. But a lot of these people had just very normal everyday names with kind of normal lives, and all of a sudden the times they were in, their particular predicaments that they were in their lives, turned them in a different direction. And some of them were not all bad for sure, and some were actually seemed like you'd really want to get to know them as friends, and others certainly not.
Yeah, they came, some of them came from very upstanding families. And so one of the big reason why they would change their name is because we might today have a bit of a romantic notion of some of these outlaws, but at the time, the families were embarrassed. I mean, the Parker family was not happy at all that their brother Robert Parker, their son Robert Parker, was an outlaw. So he became Butch Cassidy. Same thing with the Longabar family, and he became Sundance Kid and some of these others. So they were doing it really a lot of times to protect the families who were trying to have their kind of normal life, but it was anything but normal. If every few months there's a big headline about so and so, your brother just robbed another bank.
For sure, for sure. But keep at it. And I want to really thank you for being a guest on our show.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you for having me and for this conversation.
Indeed. So we will be talking to you soon. And everybody, again, Bandit Heaven, the Hole in the Wall Gangs, and the final chapter of the Wild West going on sale October 22nd, 2024. Let's get it.
Well, my thanks to you and my thanks to your listeners.
Okay. Thanks again, Tom. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Your History, Your Story. You can connect with us on Facebook and YouTube at Your History, Your Story, or on Instagram and Twitter at YHYS Podcast. We'd love to hear from you if you have any questions, comments, or a story to tell. Be well and God bless.